When we think of the Nazis, we picture men in black uniforms, 1945. Hundreds of SS women guard secretaries, even commanders, fell into Allied hands. Some were hanged, others slipped back into society, and many carried their secrets to the grave. Their forgotten fate will leave you speechless. On May 8, 1940, the guns finally fell silent, and Europe stood in ruins. Cities were reduced to ashes, millions displaced, and soldiers surrendered by the thousands. But amid the chaos, the victors uncovered something unexpected. Uniformed women, once loyal to the SS, now prisoners of war. They were not housewives or nurses. They had marched through concentration camps, signed official orders, and stood in ranks under the swastika. Their presence raised unsettling questions. Were they victims of circumstance or perpetrators who embraced ideology? As the Allies debated justice, the fate of these women became one of the war's most haunting legacies. Chapter 1. Captured and conveniently forgotten. The war was over, but the victors soon discovered that not all perpetrators of Nazi terror wore the face of men. In May 1945, as Allied troops stormed through the ruins of Germany, they found more than shattered cities and surrendering soldiers. In their custody fell women in SS uniforms, guards, auxiliaries, and clerks who had once served the machinery of genocide. Some were young, barely out of their teens, yet carried reputations that struck terror into survivors. Among them was Irma Grese, only 21 years old, but already infamous in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Survivors remembered her whip, her boots, and her chilling indifference as she directed prisoners toward punishment or death. She would later become one of the youngest women ever executed for war crimes. There was Maria Mandel, older but no less brutal, remembered by Auschwitz survivors as the Beast. She was not just a guard, but a commandant of women prisoners, orchestrating selections for the gas chambers and organizing the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, which played as thousands marched toward their deaths. Captured, too, was Elisabeth Volkenrath, chief overseer of female guards at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, whose authority extended over thousands of prisoners. Like Grese, her name became tied to the brutality of the camps and sealed her fate at the gallows. And yet, for every Grese or Mandel, there were dozens of other women, lesser known but equally implicated. Jenny Wanda Barkmann, Gerda Steinhoff, Wanda Klaff, and Elizabeth Becker, all guards at Stutthof concentration camp, faced angry crowds in Poland after liberation. Their names would not live long in post-war memory, but in 1946, they were publicly hanged after a brief but damning trial. But these were the exceptions. The vast majority of SS women captured in 1945 did not make headlines. Many were processed through makeshift internment camps, their files shuffled between Allied officers, already overwhelmed with millions of prisoners of war. Female clerks and radio operators, even those who had worn SS insignia proudly, often slipped through the cracks of justice. Some were fined, others sent to labor, and many were quietly released to rebuild new lives. Geography also determined fate. In Soviet-controlled zones, punishment was swift and harsh, with little patience for claims of innocence. In the West, women often argued coercion or naivety, claims that sometimes persuaded war-weary courts, eager to move on. This created a strange imbalance. A woman in Auschwitz might be executed in Krakow, but another with a similar record might walk free in Bavaria. The capture of these women was the first step in a reckoning that never fully came. Survivors recognized their faces, Allied officers recorded their names, but history would soon forget most of them. In the ashes of 1945, justice was uneven, memory was selective, and many of the women who had once stood inside barbed wire now disappeared into ordinary post-war lives. Chapter 2: Trials, Sentences, and Triumphs of Denial. The courtroom in Lüneburg was silent when she entered, young, blonde, and defiant. This was Irma Grese, the face of evil, cloaked in a deceptively innocent frame. Captured at Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, Grese stood trial with other SS guards in the first major Allied prosecution of concentration camp personnel. Survivors testified about her cruelty, her whip, her sadistic punishments, her role in selections for the gas chambers. She denied nothing, nor did she express remorse. At just 22 years old, she was sentenced to death and hanged in December 1945, one of the most notorious symbols of female participation in Nazi crimes. But Grese was not alone. Alongside her at the Belsen trial stood Elisabeth Volkenrath, the chief overseer of women at Auschwitz. Survivors remembered her presence during mass selections, her calm efficiency as families were torn apart. She, too, was condemned and executed. The same trial claimed the life of Juana Bormann, remembered for her dog, which she allegedly set upon prisoners at Auschwitz and Belsen. Across Europe, other tribunals followed. In Poland, the Stutthof trials exposed another group of female guards, Jenny Wanda Barkmann, Gerda Steinhoff, Elizabeth Becker, and Wanda Klaff. Eyewitnesses described their beatings, selections, and casual brutality. The women appeared young and almost ordinary in the dock, but the evidence was overwhelming. In July 1946, they were hanged before a crowd, a spectacle meant to symbolize justice delivered. Then came Maria Mandl, one of the highest-ranking women in the SS. Arrested in Austria, she was extradited to Poland for the Krakow-Auschwitz trial. Testimonies painted her as merciless, responsible for orchestrating selections where thousands were sent to their deaths. Survivors also recalled her commanding the women's orchestra, forcing musicians to play while the condemned marched past. Convicted, Mandl was executed in 1948, her name forever tied to the industrial cruelty of Auschwitz. Yet, not all verdicts were so final. Some women, like Hildegard Lechert, nicknamed Bloody Brigitte for her brutality at Majdanek, received prison terms, 15 years in her case, but were released within a decade due to amnesties in post-war Germany. Shockingly, she later worked briefly for West German intelligence, her past overlooked in the feverish politics of the Cold War. Others, like Alice Orlowski, infamous for beating prisoners and shooting into columns of deportees, also escaped the gallows. Convicted and sentenced, she served reduced time, was released, and even faced a second trial years later before quietly fading into obscurity. The trials revealed not just guilt, but a pattern. Where evidence was undeniable, sentences were severe. Where a memory faltered or political will softened, many women walked free. Denial became a common shield. I was just a secretary. I only followed orders. I did not know. Sometimes these claims failed. Sometimes they succeeded. Justice after 1945 was real, but uneven. A few names became infamous through trials and executions. Many more faded into silence, their roles minimized, their accountability diluted. The courtrooms closed, but the question lingered. Had the reckoning gone far enough? Chapter 3. Reinvention, Silence, and Society's Amnesia. The gallows silenced a few, but silence itself protected many more. When the last major trials ended, the world moved on. Germany was in ruins, millions were displaced, and the Allies now faced a new enemy in the Cold War. In this shifting climate, the fates of many SS women were quietly forgotten. For every execution or lengthy prison sentence, there were dozens who were released, exonerated, or never brought to trial at all. These women re-entered a devastated society that was eager to rebuild. They discarded uniforms, adopted new identities, and sought ordinary lives. Some married quickly, using their husbands' names to mask their past. Others claimed they had been secretaries, typists, or unwilling conscripts, roles easy enough to blend into a narrative of coercion. The denazification boards, overwhelmed with cases, often accepted such claims at face value. Take Hildegard Lechert, notorious for her cruelty at Majdanek and Ravensbrück. After her release from prison in the 1950s, she slipped into civilian life and even found employment with West Germany's new intelligence services. Her violent past was brushed aside in favor of her usefulness during the Cold War. Or Alice Orlowski, once a feared overseer at Majdanek and Auschwitz. Released early from her prison term, she lived quietly, working mundane jobs, until a later retrial briefly pulled her name back into public view. By then, she was elderly, frail, and portrayed less as a monster than as a grandmotherly figure, a stark contrast to survivor testimonies of her brutality. Perhaps most striking was Gertrude Schultz-Klink, the Reich's top women's leader, who had never been directly involved in camp atrocities, but had tirelessly preached Nazi ideology to women across Germany. Captured under a false name, she managed to avoid serious punishment. After her release, she lived out her life in obscurity, remaining unrepentant until her death in '99, still defending the ideals of the regime she once served. Society's amnesia was not accidental. West Germany in the 1950s and 60s was consumed with rebuilding, both physically and morally. Trials of female perpetrators drew less attention than those of male officers. Popular culture painted women as passive victims of war, not active enforcers. This myth gave many SS women cover to disappear into anonymity. Survivors, however, never forgot. They remembered the names, the faces, and the cruelty that often came at the hands of women who wielded power behind barbed wire. But in a society eager to turn away from the horrors of the past, those voices were too often drowned out. By the mid-20th century, many former SS women were living as housewives, secretaries, or pensioners. Some carried their secrets silently to the grave, their crimes never punished, their names erased from collective memory. The world's gaze had shifted, and in that shift, accountability slipped away. Chapter 4. Trials, Justice, and the Weight of Guilt. The ruins of Germany were not just physical, they were moral. As Allied forces advanced and the war ended, the question became unavoidable. How should the women of the SS, those who had overseen torture, executions, and starvation, be judged. For decades, history has focused on the men of the SS, Himmler, Heydrich, Kaltenbrunner. Yet among the rubble stood women like Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann, who faced justice at the British-run Belsen trials in September 1940. Their names carried weight not because they led armies, but because they wielded cruelty in camps where prisoners had no chance of survival. Irma Grese, the so-called hyena of Auschwitz, was only 22 years old when captured. Witnesses described her vicious beatings, her whip made from cellophane and wire, and her willingness to send prisoners to their deaths without hesitation. She was young, striking in appearance, yet utterly remorseless. Elisabeth Volkenrath, another female overseer, was described as cold and efficient, an administrator of death who ensured orders were carried out swiftly. Johanna Bormann, older and hardened, was infamous for unleashing her dogs on inmates. The trials were swift but dramatic. Testimonies from survivors painted these women as sadistic and unrepentant. Prisoners recalled the gleam in Grese's eyes when she struck them. Others spoke of Volkenrath's unflinching enforcement of camp orders as if she were running a factory rather than an institution of suffering. The women rarely defended themselves with remorse. Most claimed they were just following orders, a refrain that echoed from Nuremberg to the smaller war crime courts across Europe. But Allied judges and prosecutors refused to see them as passive victims of circumstance. The Belsen trials became a global symbol that women too could be agents of atrocity, not merely manipulated by men, but willing participants in a machine of mass murder. The defense of obedience crumbled under the weight of survivor testimony. On December 13, 1940, justice was delivered. Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann were sentenced to death. A few days later, they were hanged at Hamelin Prison, executed by British hangman Albert Pierrepoint. The youngest, Grese, reportedly sang a hymn on her way to the gallows, showing neither fear nor remorse. These executions shocked the world. Some viewed them as justice long overdue, while others struggled with the image of young women condemned to die for acts that defied imagination. But their punishment sent a clear message. Gender did not shield one from accountability. Cruelty, whether carried out by men or women, would not go unpunished. Beyond the high-profile cases, however, many female guards faced lighter sentences or slipped through the cracks entirely. Some were imprisoned for a few years, only to return to civilian life. Others changed names, moved to small towns, and melted into the anonymity of post-war Europe. The inconsistency of justice remains one of history's unresolved shadows. The trials etched the SS women into the annals of infamy. But they also opened a darker question. How many escaped judgment, and how did they live with the burden of silence? Chapter 5. Justice, Memory, and the Weight of History. For the captured SS women, the war did not truly end in 1945. It followed them for the rest of their lives. Justice was not only served in courts, but also in public memory, in whispers of neighbors, and in the weight of their own conscience. Unlike soldiers who could sometimes blend back into civilian life, SS women carried a stigma that never disappeared. After their release from prison, whether it was after a few years or decades, many attempted to vanish into anonymity. Irma Grese, Elizabeth Volkenrath, and Juana Bormann had been executed, but others, such as Herta Oberheiser, the only female doctor at Ravensbrück, lived for years after serving relatively light sentences. Oberheiser even returned to practicing medicine before being exposed again in the 1950s, leading to public outrage and another ban from medical work. This reveals how incomplete justice could sometimes be, as bureaucracy allowed perpetrators to slip back into ordinary life. Meanwhile, survivors of the camp never forgot. They carried testimonies into courtrooms, into history books, and into documentaries that would resurface the names of their abusers. For many SS women, the public exposure in the post-war decades was almost as devastating as imprisonment. Some were tracked down by Nazi hunters, others confronted by journalists, and many spent their final years hiding their past. The German public, too, had a conflicted relationship with these women. In the immediate post-war years, they were often painted in sensationalist tones, monsters, beasts, or the worst of the worst. Yet, historians later emphasized that they were not inhuman creatures, but ordinary women who had chosen cruelty, who had allowed ideology to turn them into perpetrators. This realization that normal people, even women expected to embody nurturing roles, could commit atrocities, was one of the most chilling lessons of the 20th century. As decades passed, the question of memory became as important as the question of punishment. How should societies remember these women? Should they be studied as part of history or left to fade in disgrace? Schools in Germany began including their crimes in Holocaust education, ensuring that their actions would not be forgotten. Trials and survivor testimonies were documented, creating an archive that future generations could never ignore. The legacy of SS women also shaped broader discussions on gender and violence. They shattered the stereotype that only men could be ruthless in war. Their presence in the machinery of the Holocaust proved that ideology and cruelty know no gender. This uncomfortable truth forced historians to confront the full depth of human capacity for violence. By the end of the century, very few SS women were still alive. Those who survived into old age lived quietly, often under false names, shadows of their former selves. Yet history had already judged them. Whether executed, imprisoned, or simply remembered, their fate was a reminder that war crimes stain not just individuals, but entire societies. The fall of the Reich ended their reign of terror, but the moral reckoning followed them to the grave. The fates of the SS women after 1940 reveal how justice, vengeance, and memory collided in the aftermath of war. Their stories remind us that history judges both men and women who choose cruelty. Should their names be remembered or erased? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.